Today we'll be covering the last main negative off-case position, the critique, spelled with a K. At its core, a critique is a criticism of the 1AC's underlying assumptions. For example, the AF might have an economy advantage that relies on capitalist framings of wealth, distribution, and hierarchies. A CAP critique, then, would directly challenge and indict those assumptions, usually with arguments about why capitalism as a whole is bad. There are a few core components that are key to every critique. The thesis of the K is its theory of power for how the world operates. Then, there must be a link to the AF that explains how and why the AF remains rooted in a problematic ideology. Next, have an impact as to why that assumption or ideology is bad. Make sure to include an alternative action that departs from the status quo. Finally, make sure to include a framework argument because K-debate framings are generally different than a traditional policy debate, given that you aren't always arguing about the direct consequences of the plan. Your framework should tell the judge to adopt a certain frame of mind when making the decision, usually in the form of a role of the ballot or a role of the judge. For example, a K framework might tell the judge to adopt the role of a critical educator instead of a policymaker because plans never pass from debate ballots. This is definitely very oversimplified, so make sure to look into some actual critiques if you want to understand them. All of the components will be dependent on the literature base that the critique is based on, so make sure to get reading. Also, K cards tend to be very long and bundle multiple components together because they are often cut from long academic works with in-depth explanations. To gain a better understanding of what your card says and what your K says, we highly recommend that you read from the sources that your cards draw from, or read the books yourselves and then cut cards from it. When answering a critique, don't be intimidated because at the end of the day, they're just another argument. You can first challenge the individual components of the argument. Why is their theory of power wrong? Does the world actually operate differently? You can make no-link arguments here. Ask, why are their assertions about the AF's assumptions not true? Maybe the AF actually changes these assumptions. That would be a link turn. What if the alt isn't actually that great? You can make solvency deficits and disadvantages to the alternative. One common example would be the seed the political argument, which states that the critique alternative would remove the possibility to challenge problematic forces in political spaces like Congress, which results in even more harmful impacts happening to the group of people that the K wants to protect. If you remember the counterplan video, permutations apply to critiques very similarly. This time, make sure to contextualize the K itself by explaining why the perm would resolve the harmful assumptions identified by their authors. Finally, make sure to leverage the AF whenever possible. However, you'll need to win the framework debate. Frame what the role of the plan is within the debate and explain why you get to weigh its consequences against the critique, because K teams will do everything they can to make sure you don't get to. You can even cross-apply concepts from a topicality and theory video by explaining why it's more educational and/or fair for teams to include discussions of the 1AC's consequences in K debates. If you do get to weigh the AF, you will have to contextualize always. Soft left impacts generally lend themselves to the step in the right direction framing, making it easy to mitigate the risk of a link or to strengthen the permutations by arguing that learning about the intricacies of the state makes challenging it easier. If your AF has an extinction impact, you could argue that everyone's death would include the people their K might be advocating for, meaning that only a permutation which saves everyone's lives in the short term would then allow for the possibility of their alternative. Prepping for every individual critique with specific answers can be very challenging, so you can always resort to the impact turn strategy. As a preface, do not make arguments like racism good, sexism good, and/or homophobia good for very obvious reasons. Hegemony good and capitalism good are the most common turns because they apply to a majority of Ks. Against the imperialism or cap K, the turn is very easy to make, but against other Ks, you might have to do slightly more link work. However, that link can simply be established in cross-checks as well. When reading turns, do not contradict your own AF. Otherwise, the neg team can just kick out of the K and defend the impact turn against your AF. There are so many ways to answer K, and we've only really scratched the surface. So our main word of advice is to research and understand. If you can confidently explain what your plan does and what your 1AC looks like, and understand what their main argument is, you can likely defend your worldview. The world of critiques is super intimidating because the level of argumentation tends to be extremely integrated within its source material, meaning that even average K debates require a high level of knowledge from both teams. Some teams or debaters are even known to specialize in specific literature bases like settler colonialism or Afro-pessimism because of the amount of time they've spent in the area. Even if you're not an expert on Marxism, you can always include a critique within your broader neg strategy or understand the various arguments so you can better answer them. More importantly, you might learn a thing or two about the world.